Good evening, community. It is a true pleasure to be with you once again, bringing you the most macabre and terrifying stories that reach us every week. If you would like to send in your story, our email is in the video description. We thank each person who continues to share their stories with us. Now, I invite you to turn off the lights and put on your headphones if you can. The most important thing is for you to let yourself be carried away by the upcoming stories. The night was calm, one of those where the silence feels almost comforting. Inside the apartment, everything exuded a sense of familiarity. The gentle warmth from the heater cut through the cold outside, and the walls, dimly lit by the soft lights, seemed to embrace the lone tenant in a comforting routine. The distant noise of cars was muffled, and the sounds of the city were nothing more than a subtle background echo, almost insignificant. There, in the heart of that apartment, they felt safe. The space was small but comfortable. The arrangement of the furniture, the sound of the clock on the wall, the soft glow from the kitchen lamp, all contributed to a feeling of peace. It was a sanctuary against the chaos outside. But it was precisely this tranquility that concealed something. In the air, something invisible moved at the edges of perception, like a shadow you don't notice until it's too late. The hot water cascaded over the tenants' shoulders, running down their body, bringing a sense of relief after a long day. The bathroom was enveloped in steam, the walls fogged up, and the mirror completely covered by a thin layer of condensation. It was one of those simple, almost meditative moments where thoughts drift aimlessly, and the warmth of the water soothes every tired muscle. But then, amid this comfort, something felt off. A sound, a whisper, so faint that, for a moment, they thought they had imagined it. The noise was absorbed by the constant flow of water, disappearing almost as quickly as it had appeared. They stood still for a few seconds, listening, ears picking up only the sound of the shower and the soft echo of water hitting the floor. Nothing. It had to be the plumbing, they thought, a natural reaction to the water pressure. Maybe the sound of old pipes. With a slight shrug, they relaxed again, convinced there was no reason for concern. But then, again, a whisper, this time clearer, distinct, almost human. It was faint, coming from somewhere very close. They slowly turned their head, looking around the bathroom as if expecting to see something. The shower curtain was slightly open, revealing only a portion of the fogged-up mirror and part of the bathroom floor. Everything was quiet, except for the sound of the water. Their hearts sped up slightly, a twinge of unease creeping down their spine. They turned off the shower, and the sound of the water stopped abruptly, leaving the room in a muffled silence, the dripping of water creating small echoes on the tiles. They stood there motionless, waiting to hear it again. The apartment, so cozy and safe just minutes ago, now felt different, as if something invisible was moving in the shadows. Seconds passed, but there was no further whisper, only the heavy, almost oppressive silence. They laughed nervously, trying to convince themselves it had all been their imagination. They were tired, that was it. Exhaustion plays tricks on the mind, creates sounds, shapes, makes your eyes see things that aren't there. They grabbed the towel and began to dry off quickly, eager to leave the bathroom and shake off that strange sense of unease. But as they moved, drying their face, they heard it again. This time, the whisper was closer, clearer, and it seemed to form words, though they couldn't understand what was being said. A chill ran down their spine, and for the first time they felt a presence, as if they were no longer alone. Something was watching. They hurried out of the bathroom, the towel wrapped around their waist, hair still dripping wet. The sense of safety and comfort that had surrounded them at the start of the night had completely vanished. As they walked down the hallway, the whispers they had heard seemed to echo in their mind, even though the environment was now almost eerily silent. With each step, the apartment, once so familiar, felt larger, emptier, stranger. They tried to shake off the unease, convincing themselves it was just their imagination. They turned on the television in the living room, hoping the sound of voices would fill the space and break that oppressive silence. But no matter how hard they tried, something was wrong. The shadows on the walls seemed denser, as if they pulsed in the dim light coming from the corner lamp. The sound of the television, instead of bringing comfort, mixed disjointedly with the atmosphere, like it was distant, muffled, almost irrelevant. They ran a hand through their still wet hair and dropped onto the sofa, trying to ignore the persistent feeling of being watched. The apartment was small, a space they knew by heart. Every piece of furniture was in its place, every object where it always had been. But tonight, everything felt different. There was a presence, something in the air, something they couldn't see, but that made itself felt with every beat of their racing heart. Suddenly, the kitchen light flickered. Once, twice, until it went out completely, plunging the room into an even more unsettling dimness. They stood up slowly, their eyes fixed on the kitchen doorway, which now looked like a portal to something dark and unknown. They took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. It was just a fuse, they told themselves. Light bulbs sometimes burn out, nothing more. But in the back of their mind, the feeling of being watched grew, insistent. It was as if something was moving in the shadows, something they couldn't see directly, but that was there, lurking, waiting for a moment of distraction. They took a few steps toward the kitchen but stopped halfway, feeling that approaching the darkness would be like crossing a boundary that should never be crossed. And then the whispers started again. This time, they weren't confined to the bathroom. They seemed to come from everywhere, from the corners of the living room, from the dark hallway, from the shadows behind the sofa. They were faint, but impossible to ignore, like an incessant murmur scratching at the edges of their sanity. They closed their eyes for a moment, trying to block out the sound, but it was useless. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if the voices were trying to communicate, trying to break through some invisible veil separating them and the thing lurking in the shadows. They opened their eyes, their chest rising and falling rapidly. The air was heavy, difficult to breathe, and the apartment seemed to close in around them, becoming oppressive, claustrophobic. The living room lights were still flickering, threatening to go out at any moment, and they felt with crushing certainty that they were no longer alone. The feeling of being watched was now tangible, as though invisible eyes were in every corner, spying, judging, waiting for them to make a mistake. And then, in the reflection of the living room mirror, they saw a shape pass quickly behind them. Something moved in silence, disappearing before they could focus on it. They turned immediately, heart pounding, but there was nothing. Only emptiness and shadows, which seemed denser with each passing second. The apartment, which had always been their refuge, now felt like a prison. Something was there, and the game had only just begun. Their breathing became quick and uneven, each breath heavy, weighed down by the invisible presence that now filled the apartment. They stood frozen in the middle of the living room, glancing in every direction, waiting for something to move, some sign of what was watching them. But what they felt was even more terrifying than any physical figure. It was the constant whispering, soft and persistent, now impossible to escape, as if it had seeped into the very air around them. The whispers. They wouldn't stop. They moved along the walls, bounced off the furniture, and seemed to ooze from the shadows that had gathered in the darkest corners of the room. The voices were indistinct, impossible to understand, but they carried a sinister urgency, an expectation that chilled their blood. They felt as if they were on the verge of understanding something, on the brink of being consumed by knowledge their mind refused to accept. They glanced at the clock. Only a few minutes had passed, but it felt like an eternity had unfolded around them. Each passing second made the sensation of being watched grow, until it was unbearable. They could no longer ignore it. Each time they turned their head, the fleeting glimpse of a shape just outside their vision sent a shiver through their entire body. It was always too fast to focus on, always on the edges of their perception, taunting them, as if something was playing with them, waiting for the perfect moment. They tried to turn on every light in the house, but some of them wouldn't respond, while others flickered erratically, casting the room into brief, strobe-like flashes of darkness. In every moment, the light failed. They felt the shadows move, stretch, as if they were alive, slowly closing in on them. It was as if the very structure of the apartment was changing, the rooms feeling longer, more twisted, and the walls seemed to be closing in on them, trapping them in a labyrinth that no longer made sense. They rushed to the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind them, their heart pounding. The bedroom felt safer, but that was just an illusion. They knew that now. The shadows outside didn't need an open door. The whispers, now louder, seemed to seep through the cracks, slipping under the door, through the walls, wrapping around their thoughts. It was as if their mind was being invaded, overtaken by something they couldn't control. And then, a strange realization took hold. This wasn't their apartment anymore. They weren't in their home. Something had taken over, a presence that had infiltrated their space and transformed it into something else entirely. Every piece of the environment, every familiar object, now seemed charged with an unknown purpose. It was as if they were being lured into a trap, and the voices were calling, hypnotic, trying to convince them to surrender to that invisible force. They glanced at the wardrobe mirror, and for the first time they saw it clearly. It wasn't a reflection, but something behind them, a long, undefined shadow, a figure that had no precise contours, but it was there, watching them. They spun around immediately, heart in their throat, but once again, nothing, just emptiness. Desperation began to take hold. There was nowhere to run, and every corner of the apartment seemed to close in around them, the shadows gaining a life of their own, stretching like invisible fingers ready to pull them in. They tried to scream, but the sound died in their throat. Fear crushed their voice, their body paralyzed by the overwhelming presence of something they couldn't see but felt like a suffocating force. And then they realized the whispers weren't coming from outside, they were coming from within. The voices were inside their head, whispering secrets their mind refused to hear, unearthing ancient fears, digging deep into their sanity. That presence, whatever it was, had been waiting. It knew them, understood them in a way no one else ever had. It was playing with them, manipulating them, like a spider weaving its web around its prey. They knew, deep down, that there was no turning back. Whatever was in that apartment wasn't just some entity. It was something ancient, a force that existed beyond human comprehension, beyond time. And now, that force was with them, and it wasn't going to leave. The apartment wasn't a refuge anymore. It was the maw of something much greater, something that was about to swallow them whole. The bedroom seemed to shrink around them, the shadows moving with a slow, sinister intent, as if they were alive, watching every step, the whispering now constant, a presence in their mind, a distorted melody they couldn't block out. They knew they were at the edge of something, some point of no return. The apartment, once a safe haven, felt like an alien place, ruled by forces beyond anything they could understand. They stood from the bed, body trembling, breath shallow. They couldn't stay here, trapped. Something was closing in, getting closer, and they could feel that with every passing second, they were on the verge of being consumed. The lights flickered frenetically, the mirror in the corner of the room seemed to pulse, and the air felt thick, heavy, like they were moving through something invisible. But the whispers, they weren't just whispers anymore. Now they formed words, phrases they still couldn't fully grasp, but they were starting to take shape in their mind. A presence was trying to communicate, or maybe it wasn't just one presence. The voices sounded like many, intertwined, different tones and frequencies, a cacophony of voices surrounding them like a net. They stumbled into the hallway, eyes fixed on the darkness pooling in the living room. They were ready to face whatever it was. Not because they wanted to, but because they knew they had no other choice. It was as if something was pulling them, drawing them toward the heart of the apartment, where the sensation of presence was strongest. With every step, the whispers grew louder, clearer, and more urgent. They could hear fragmented words, disjointed pieces of an ancient language, something primal and unforgiving. As they reached the living room, they saw it. In the middle of the room, the shadows swirled, spinning slowly like a storm of black smoke. In the center of that darkness, a shape began to take form, something vaguely human but grotesquely wrong. It was a figure with no clear boundaries, its edges blurred as if it existed partially within and outside this reality. Its eyes were two deep, empty slits that stared at them as if probing every corner of their soul. They froze, unable to move. The voices in their head were now unbearable, screaming, pleading, demanding them to get closer. The presence in the room seemed to grow, expanding beyond the apartment walls, filling the entire space with an energy that crushed them. The air was thick, hard to breathe, and each heartbeat echoed in their ears like a sinister drum. They tried to step back, but their feet were stuck, as if the very ground was holding them in place. The shadows began to stretch toward them, like invisible hands, slow and inevitable. The figure in the center of the room didn't move, but its power, its influence, was undeniable. It was as if the darkness itself had a consciousness, something that existed beyond time and space, beyond human understanding. And that thing had chosen them. In a last act of desperation, they tried to scream, but no sound came out. Their hands shook, eyes wide, fixed on the thing before them as the shadows finally wrapped around them. The warmth of the room was replaced by an intense cold, as if the very air around them was being sucked into that vortex of darkness. And then, silence. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving the apartment in a crushing, suffocating quiet. The shadowy figure, now fully formed, stood just a few feet away, its eyes staring into them with a terrible stillness, a stillness that spoke of eternities and ancient horrors far beyond their comprehension. They finally understood. This wasn't just any entity. They were standing before something much greater, something that existed beyond the limits of this world. That thing watching them was an ancient force, something that had always been there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for someone, waiting for them. The apartment had never been just an ordinary place. It was a portal, a passageway to something far older and far more terrifying. And in a single moment, they realized the true horror. The whispers weren't warnings. They weren't telling them to escape. They were invitations. They had been called, chosen by that invisible presence. There was no going back now. The shadows consumed them entirely, and in the moment they did, they knew they had crossed a boundary into something no human was ever meant to know. Everything went dark. The apartment, the world around them, everything dissolved into eternal darkness, and they were taken by the force that had watched them all night. The game was over, and they had lost. The silence in the apartment was absolute, almost tangible. The darkness that had once pulsed in the shadows was now still, cold, as if the very atmosphere had been suspended in time. Nothing moved. The living room, once the stage of an invisible battle, was now submerged in a sinister stillness. The lights that had flickered so violently were now extinguished, and the apartment felt empty, abandoned. The air, once heavy and oppressive, now lay still, as if all life had been drained from the space. The figure the tenant had seen, that indefinable presence, had disappeared along with them. There were no signs of struggle, no sound or hint of movement. Only the distant echo of the whispers, now silenced, as if they had never existed. The apartment's walls remained unchanged, the clock still ticking in its steady rhythm, and the windows reflected the darkness of the night outside. Everything seemed normal, but it wasn't. The apartment, though it appeared the same, would never be the same again. Something had changed, something had been awakened, and it now inhabited that space permanently. The invisible presence that had pursued them hadn't left with them. It was still there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. And in that suffocating silence, one thing was certain: the tenant would never truly be alone again. Even though no one else would know what had happened there, the darkness knew. The shadows knew. They were always lurking, always watching. And in the heart of that apartment, the invisible presence remained, patient, silent, waiting for the next. You've always prided yourself on being a good observer. Quiet, unassuming, you watch the world from the comfort of your own home. The view from your window reveals a peaceful street, the kind where nothing ever happens. But lately, you've noticed something different. It's the man who lives next door, the one no one seems to know much about. He's always been a little strange, but never enough to raise any alarm. At first it was small things, odd timings, strange comings and goings at night. You told yourself it was nothing, that everyone has their quirks. But then there were the sounds, muffled, almost like whispers, sometimes late into the night, when the rest of the neighborhood was asleep. And the smell, a faint, sickly odor, like rotting meat, drifting from his house, carried on the breeze into your open windows. Your mind began to spin, connecting dots that may not have been there. Was it paranoia? Or was it instinct, You couldn't be sure, but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. You started watching him more closely, noticing things you hadn't before. The way he never seemed to interact with anyone. The way he would disappear for days at a time, only to return with bags, heavy, bulging bags that he carried into the house under the cover of darkness. You try to dismiss it. After all, you have no proof. But in the pit of your stomach, you feel it. Something's not right. You've convinced yourself that the man next door is hiding something. Something dark, something dangerous. And now, you have to find out what it is. It's late, well past midnight, and the world outside your window is cloaked in silence. From the safety of your living room, you keep your eyes trained on the house next door. The streetlights barely reach its crumbling facade, leaving most of it shrouded in shadows. But there's movement inside. You can just make out a faint glow flickering behind the curtains. He's awake again. You grab your binoculars, the ones you swore you'd never use for anything like this. But curiosity has turned into something darker, an obsession you can't shake. You focus in, peering through the narrow gap in the curtains. He's pacing back and forth, his silhouette jittery in the dim light. Something about the way he moves feels off. It's frantic, as if he's nervous, hiding something. Then you see it. A second shadow, barely noticeable, flickers just behind him. At first, you think it's a trick of the light, but no, it's there. Another figure, something lurking in the dark behind him. The realization sends a chill crawling up your spine. Who, or what, is in that house with him? The light flickers out, plunging the house into darkness. Your heart races as you pull back from the window, the binoculars slipping from your trembling hands. Questions flood your mind. Who else is in that house? You've never seen anyone go in or out but him. And the noises, the ones you've been hearing at night, suddenly make sense. You try to push it out of your head, tell yourself that you're imagining things, but you know you're past the point of turning back. Something is wrong, desperately wrong. And whatever it is, it's hidden inside those walls, just beyond the reach of your sight. You begin digging, researching, scanning through local records, old news articles, anything that might offer a glimpse into the man's past. You find whispers, small, unsettling mentions of the house, of people who used to live there but vanished without a trace. The further you dig, the worse it gets. The dates line up with the times you've seen him disappear for days, and the rumors hint at disappearances, at something sinister lurking beneath the surface of the neighborhood's quiet calm. Your heart pounds as you realize the truth is closer than you thought. You can't stop now. Whatever he's hiding, you have to know. It's a cold night when you make the decision. The fear gnaws at you, but it's too late to stop. You've spent too many sleepless nights staring at that house, watching, waiting for a sign. The flickering light in the attic has been on for hours now, longer than usual. Something is different tonight. The street is eerily quiet as you step out of your house, heart hammering in your chest. Every shadow feels like it's watching you, the night air thick with tension. You walk slowly, silently, as if the very darkness is a warning. But you don't turn back. Not now. The front door is locked as you expected, but you've already scoped out another way in, the basement window, low and partially cracked. Your hands shake as you pry it open and slide inside, landing softly on the dusty floor. The smell hits you immediately, stronger here inside. That same rancid odor of decay, only now it clings to your skin, making your stomach turn. You stand still, listening. The house is silent, almost too silent. Every instinct screams at you to leave, but you press forward. The air feels heavy, as though the house itself is alive, watching, waiting for you to make a wrong move. The halls are narrow, the wallpaper peeling like old skin, and the shadows seem to reach out, pulling you deeper into the belly of the beast. You creep through the house, step by agonizing step, every creak of the floorboards sending a jolt of fear through your body. The light from your flashlight flickers, casting long, distorted shadows that dance across the walls. As you make your way upstairs, the air becomes colder, more oppressive. The flickering light you saw from your window is coming from behind a door at the end of the hall, the locked door. It's an old, heavy thing, the kind that feels more like a barrier than a door. You press your ear against it, and there, just beneath the hum of silence, you hear something. A faint rhythmic sound, like breathing. or worse, like something struggling to breathe. Your fingers tremble as you reach for the handle. Locked. Of course, it's locked. But there's a keyhole, and through it you can see just a sliver of what lies beyond. You lower yourself to your knees, hesitating for a moment before you peer through. At first, you see nothing, just darkness. Then, slowly, your eyes adjust, and you see it. A shape, a figure hunched over in the gloom, its movements slow and deliberate. Your heart stops as you realize what you're looking at. The man is not alone. There's someone, no, something, on the other side of the door with him. Something that doesn't belong here. Something that shouldn't exist. And now you know. You were right all along. Whatever he's hiding, it's worse than you imagined. The sound of footsteps echoes from downstairs. He's coming. Panic grips you, but there's no time to waste. The footsteps grow louder, more deliberate, as if he knows someone is in his home. You scramble to your feet and glance around frantically, your mind racing for a solution. There's no way back, only forward. You need to get behind that door. Your trembling hands reach into your pocket, pulling out a small, thin piece of metal you brought with you, a makeshift lockpick, something you never thought you'd actually use. Your fingers fumble, the keyhole stubborn and unforgiving, but with a desperate twist, you feel the mechanism click. The door creaks open, and you slip inside, closing it quietly behind you just as the footsteps reach the top of the stairs. The room beyond is pitch black, save for the faint glow of a single bulb swinging from the ceiling. Your flashlight beam cuts through the darkness, revealing a nightmare that steals your breath away. The room is a grotesque shrine to violence and madness. The walls are stained with old blood, long-dried splatters marking where countless victims met their end. The stench of decay is overpowering now, so thick it coats your throat. In the far corner you see it, an old rusted chair bolted to the floor, chains hanging from its arms and legs. But that's not the worst of it. The real horror lies in the center of the room. A pit, yawning wide like an open mouth, descends into darkness. It's deeper than you can fathom, the bottom lost in shadow. Around the edge of the pit, grotesque objects hang on the walls, tools, knives, saws, each one caked with dried blood. Your heart races as you realize this isn't just a place of death, it's a place of torture, a place where people are brought to suffer. And then you see the remains. Scattered across the floor, barely recognizable, are the twisted remnants of the man's victims. Bones gnawed clean, limbs discarded like trash. The air hums with the weight of unspeakable acts that have taken place here. You take a step back, your stomach churning, and almost stumble over something. When you turn, you freeze. In the corner, barely visible in the flickering light, is a person. No, a body. Pale, thin, and unmoving, but not yet dead. Eyes wide, mouth gagged, wrists bound, they're barely clinging to life. You rush to their side, your hands shaking as you try to pull at the ropes binding them. But then you hear it, a soft click, the sound of a door opening behind you. The man has entered the room. For a moment, time seems to stop. You don't dare move. His footsteps are slow, deliberate as he approaches. You feel the weight of his presence before you see him. The flashlight trembles in your hand as you turn it toward the source of the sound. He stands at the doorway, bathed in shadow, his face calm, but his eyes are cold, dead. He knows what you've seen. He knows you've uncovered his secret. And now, you're trapped here with him, inside this house of horrors. You want to run, to scream, to fight. But the realization sinks in like a dagger. You've stepped into a place you were never meant to leave. The door behind you slams shut with a heavy thud. The door slams shut, and the sound echoes like a final deafening heartbeat. You spin around, your pulse hammering in your ears. He's standing there, blocking your only way out, a slow, twisted smile creeping across his face. The flashlight beam flickers as you hold it in trembling hands, casting long, distorted shadows across the blood-stained room. He takes a step closer, slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the fear in its prey. His eyes are dark, empty, as though whatever humanity once lived in him has long since rotted away. You can't breathe. Your mind screams at you to run, but where? You glance around, searching desperately for an escape route, but there's nowhere to go. Then, without warning, he lunges. Adrenaline surges through you as you leap to the side, barely dodging his grasp. The flashlight drops, clattering to the floor, and the room plunges into darkness. You scramble blindly, your hands brushing against the cold, slick floor, trying to find something, anything you can use to defend yourself. Your fingers close around a metal object, a heavy wrench. You grip it tightly, your breath coming in short, ragged bursts as you listen. The room is silent again, but you know he's there, stalking you, moving quietly through the shadows. You swing wildly, the wrench cutting through the air, but it hits nothing. The silence is unbearable, the waiting, the tension. He's toying with you. Suddenly you hear a rustle, just behind you. Instinct takes over and you swing again, harder this time. There's a sickening thud, followed by a low grunt of pain. For a moment, everything stops. The room feels still, too still. You can barely make out his shape in the dark, clutching his head, staggering back. But he's not down. Not yet. He roars with fury and charges at you, and this time, you're not quick enough. His hands clamp down on your throat, squeezing, lifting you off the ground. You struggle, gasping for air, kicking desperately as his grip tightens. His face is inches from yours now, twisted into something monstrous, something not quite human. With the last bit of strength you can muster, you swing the wrench again, this time connecting with his jaw. He stumbles, his grip loosening just enough for you to slip free. You hit the ground hard, coughing, gasping for breath, but there's no time to stop. You scramble to your feet, blood pounding in your ears, and make a dash for the door. It won't budge. He's locked you in. Desperation claws at you as you search for another way out. The window. There's a small, barred window in the corner. If you can break through it, maybe you can squeeze through. But as you turn toward it, you see him rising to his feet again, blood dripping from his mouth, a crazed look in his eyes. He's coming for you, slower this time, but determined, unstoppable. You race to the window, grabbing a nearby chair and slamming it against the glass. The first hit barely cracks it. You swing again, harder, and the glass shatters, raining shards onto the floor. But the bars, they won't give. Behind you, his footsteps grow louder, closer. You're running out of time. And then you remember the pit. It's a horrible, desperate thought, but it's all you have left. You run to the edge, staring into the black abyss, your heart racing. There's no telling what's down there, but it's your only chance. You glance back at him. He's nearly on you now, his eyes wild with fury, and without thinking, you throw yourself into the darkness. The fall is longer than you expected. For a brief moment, you're weightless, plummeting into the unknown. And then, with a bone-jarring impact, you hit the bottom. Pain explodes through your body, but you're alive. Barely. Above you, the man's face appears at the edge of the pit, staring down with a look of pure rage. But he won't follow. Not down here. Whatever horrors this pit holds, even he is afraid of them. You crawl, dragging yourself through the filth and darkness, every inch agonizing, your body screaming in pain. Somewhere in the distance, you hear something stirring, a soft, wet sound, like something crawling, slithering closer. You don't have time to think about what it is. You have to keep moving. There has to be another way out. There has to be. And as you inch forward, the realization hits you. The real nightmare isn't him. It's what he's been feeding down here. And now you're part of it. The darkness in the pit feels endless. Your body aches from the fall, every breath ragged and shallow. The sounds around you, wet, slithering things, draw closer, but you don't dare look back. Crawling through the filth, your mind races, searching for a way out. The walls are cold, damp, and slick, closing in on you like the jaws of some immense, unseen creature. Just when you think there's no escape, your hand brushes against something, a faint draft of cool air. Your heart skips a beat. An exit, maybe? You push forward with renewed desperation, the sound of whatever lurks in the shadows fading behind you. The space begins to open up, and you see it. A small crack in the stone wall, just wide enough to squeeze through. You don't think. You push your battered body through the opening, the rough stone scraping your skin until finally, you burst out into the open night air. The cold wind hits you like a slap, but you don't stop. You run. You don't know where you're going, but you know you need to put as much distance between yourself and that house as possible. When you finally collapse, miles from the house, your body gives out, and everything goes dark. When you wake, the morning sun is creeping over the horizon. Your clothes are torn, your body covered in bruises and cuts, but you're alive. Somehow, you made it out. You stumble toward the nearest road, flagging down a passing car. The driver, horrified by the sight of you, rushes you to safety. The authorities come. You tell them everything: the man, the house, the pit. They listen, but when they arrive at the house, it's as if it was all a nightmare. The basement is empty. The pit is gone. There's no evidence of the horrors you witnessed, no sign of the twisted room or the monstrous things lurking beneath the house. The man disappeared. No trace of him anywhere. The neighbors don't even seem to remember much about him, as if he had never truly existed. But you remember the sights, the sounds, the smell of death. It's all burned into your memory. Every time you close your eyes, you see his face, feel his hands tightening around your throat. The nightmares don't stop. And even worse is the knowledge that he's still out there, somewhere, waiting, watching. You can feel it deep down. The terror hasn't ended. It's only moved on. The next neighborhood, the next quiet street. He's out there, in the shadows, hunting again. The apartment complex stands quiet in the gloom of the late night, the kind of silence that feels almost too heavy, too still. The rain from earlier has left the streets slick and gleaming under the dim, flickering streetlights. A lone police officer steps out of their car, weary from another long shift, their muscles aching, the weight of the day still hanging over them. The air is cool, thick with the smell of wet pavement, and as they walk towards the entrance of the building, they exhale, eager for the comfort of home. But tonight, the building feels different. It's subtle at first, just a slight shift in the atmosphere. The usual hum of the city, the distant sounds of traffic, seem quieter than usual. As the officer climbs the stairs, the flickering overhead light casts long, erratic shadows across the narrow hallway. And that's when they feel it. A faint, creeping sensation crawling up their spine, the unmistakable primal sense of being watched. Their heart skips a beat. It's just exhaustion, they tell themselves. Just the mind playing tricks after hours of stress and adrenaline. Still, they quicken their pace. The key slides into the lock, the door groans slightly as it pushes open, and immediately, the officer freezes. Something is wrong. The door isn't fully closed. A sliver of light escapes from the inside, casting strange wavering shadows onto the threshold. The hallway, which moments ago seemed merely quiet, now feels oppressive, suffocating. Their hand moves instinctively to the grip of their service weapon, fingers tightening around it as they step forward. From behind the door, they hear it, a faint rustling, barely perceptible but undeniably there. Someone is inside. The officer's pulse quickens as they push the door open just a little more, each movement slow, deliberate. The creak of the hinges echoes in the stillness, louder than it should be, a sound that sends a shiver down their spine. The apartment, their sanctuary, feels foreign now, its familiar warmth replaced with something cold, invasive. Inside, the soft glow of a single lamp spills across the room, casting long, unnatural shadows that seem to stretch and warp with every flicker. The officer steps inside, careful, silent. The living room looks disturbed. Drawers left half open, papers scattered on the floor, objects overturned. Every detail screams of intrusion, a violation of their personal space. Then, they hear it again. A faint rustling, like someone rummaging through their belongings in the next room. The officer's breath catches, their heart pounding louder in their ears. A metallic taste fills their mouth as they step forward, moving deeper into the apartment. Each step feels heavier, like the air itself is thickening around them. As they reach the door to the bedroom, it's already slightly ajar, and beyond it, in the dimness, a shadow moves. The officer halts, eyes narrowing as they peer inside. A figure, tall, broad, stands with their back turned, rifling through drawers, moving with a strange, methodical calm. There's no sense of panic or rush. Whoever this is, they're searching for something specific. The officer's hand hovers near their weapon, heart racing. But something holds them back. An inexplicable tension grips their chest, a sense of wrongness beyond the break-in. This isn't just some common burglar. They call out, voice sharp, commanding the figure to stop. But the intruder doesn't react, doesn't even flinch. Instead, slowly, with a chilling calmness, the figure begins to turn. The figure moves with an unsettling slowness, turning toward the officer, and in the dim light, something feels wrong, profoundly wrong. As the intruder's face comes into view, it's not what the officer expects. A smooth, featureless mask stares back, blank and expressionless, reflecting the faint glow of the lamp. The eyes behind it are hidden in darkness, unreadable, but the officer feels them watching, measuring. For a moment, neither of them moves. The apartment is silent, the air between them thick with a growing, unbearable tension. The officer's mind races, trying to make sense of the situation. The mask, the calmness, the intruder's brazen lack of fear, none of it adds up. There's no frantic scrambling, no attempt to flee or attack, just that chilling, deliberate stillness. The officer grips their weapon, fingers tight around the handle, ready to act. But before they can speak, before they can demand answers, the intruder takes a single step forward. It's slow, purposeful. The officer's breath catches in their throat. "Stay where you are," they shout, voice cracking with tension. But the figure moves again, another step closer, completely unfazed by the warning. Something primal stirs in the officer, a deep, gut-wrenching sense that they're not just dealing with an ordinary person. There's an unnatural confidence in the intruder's movements, a predatory calmness that makes their skin crawl. Another step. The officer's heart races, adrenaline surging as their grip tightens on the gun. The figure is too close now, too composed, too calm. Fear mixes with confusion. Why won't they stop? Why aren't they running, like any other burglar would? Then, without warning, the figure lunges. It's faster than the officer anticipated, inhumanly fast. The officer barely has time to react, pulling the trigger as the intruder charges forward. The sound of the gunshot echoes through the apartment, but the figure doesn't stop. They collide, and suddenly the officer is fighting for their life. The impact is brutal. The officer stumbles backward, crashing into a side table, sending a lamp shattering to the floor. The figure is on them in an instant, hands grabbing at the officer with a strength that feels impossible, cold and relentless. They struggle, thrashing in the confined space of the small apartment, the sound of heavy breaths and grunts filling the air, mingling with the screech of furniture scraping across the floor. The officer swings an elbow into the intruder's side, momentarily freeing themselves. They stagger back, reaching for their weapon, but the figure moves again, quicker this time, more forceful, almost animalistic in its intensity. The officer barely manages to dodge, feeling the rush of air as the intruder's hand sweeps just past their head. It's chaos. The room spins with overturned furniture, the air thick with dust and adrenaline. The officer's mind races, instincts kicking in as they look for any advantage, any opportunity to escape or overpower this intruder. But there's something unnerving about the way the figure moves, something too precise, too calculated. Every time the officer thinks they have a moment to act, the figure is already there, closing the distance, a silent predator in the darkened apartment. Desperation claws at the officer's chest as they finally get a grip on their gun again. They raise it, pointing directly at the intruder. "Stay back," they shout, their voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. But the figure doesn't stop. It doesn't even hesitate. Another gunshot rings out, the muzzle flash briefly illuminating the intruder's mask, still blank, still unreadable. The shot should have hit. It should have stopped them. But it didn't. The figure keeps coming, relentless, like something out of a nightmare. Panic surges through the officer. How is this possible? How are they still standing? With the last of their strength, the officer throws themselves at the intruder, grabbing at the mask in a desperate attempt to break the figure's composure, to see who or what they're dealing with. Their fingers curl under the edges of the mask, and with a swift yank, it comes free. What they see beneath it is worse than anything they could have imagined. The face looking back at them is their own, twisted, distorted, eyes wide with a maddening gleam, a grotesque grin stretching across their features, mirroring every fear the officer has ever buried deep inside. The intruder isn't just wearing their face, it is their face. A paralyzing shock ripples through the officer's body, and for the first time that night, they feel truly helpless. The mask falls to the floor with a dull thud, but the sound feels distant, almost drowned out by the rapid thudding of the officer's heart. Time seems to slow as they stare into the face, their own face, twisted, deformed, and yet unmistakably theirs. The familiar features are there, but distorted, warped into something monstrous. The eyes, once sharp and clear, are now wide with a wild, unsettling madness, reflecting a depth of fear and rage the officer can't comprehend. The grotesque smile, their smile, stretches impossibly wide across the intruder's face, as if mocking the officer's very existence. The grin twists and contorts in a way that feels inhuman, a horrific parody of what they've seen in the mirror countless times. For a brief, disorienting moment, the officer can't tell if they're awake or trapped in some vivid, sickening nightmare. The room feels like it's closing in, the walls bending and warping, as if reality itself is unraveling. The officer stumbles back, struggling to find their balance, their mind racing to make sense of the impossible. How could this be happening? What kind of horror is this? The figure takes another step forward, and with each movement, it feels less human, its body twisting unnaturally, jerking forward with an eerie fluidity. The officer's hands shake violently as they raise the gun again, but their grip falters. The weapon, once a source of control, now feels useless in their hands. What good is it against something like this? Against something that wears their own face? The intruder, their twisted reflection, lets out a low, guttural chuckle, the sound sending chills down the officer's spine. It feels like the very essence of their worst fears brought to life, manifesting in front of them. The officer backs away further, heart pounding in their throat, but the space around them seems to shrink with every step. Panic threatens to overtake them, but they force themselves to move, to act. With one last desperate effort, the officer lunges at the figure, swinging wildly, trying to overpower this thing that has taken on their own identity. But it's no use. The figure is too fast, too strong, and with a bone-chilling precision, it grabs the officer by the throat. The grip is icy, suffocating, and as the officer gasps for air, they see it in the figure's eyes, that terrible, gleaming madness, a reflection of everything they've fought to suppress, every fear, every regret. The officer's vision blurs, darkness creeping in at the edges. They're losing, and it's not just their body that's failing. It's their mind, their very sense of self, unraveling in the face of this impossible horror. In that moment, the officer realizes the terrifying truth. This intruder isn't some stranger. It isn't even human. It's something far worse, a manifestation of their own darkness, their own inner demons, brought to life. And as they slip closer to unconsciousness, the officer knows they have one last choice: face this nightmare head-on, or be consumed by it. The apartment is deathly silent. The officer stands alone in the middle of the wreckage, gasping for air, the eerie quiet pressing down like a heavy weight. The intruder is gone, vanished, as if they were never there at all. No sign of struggle, no blood, no mask. Just the officer, trembling in the chaos of their own home. Their chest rises and falls rapidly, adrenaline still coursing through their veins, but something about the room feels off. The familiar space is wrong now, tainted. Every shadow seems to stretch too far. Every creak of the floorboards feels like a distant whisper. The officer glances around, searching for any trace of what just happened, but it's as if the entire confrontation had been erased from existence. And yet, the fear lingers. Stumbling toward the window, the officer looks out into the quiet street below. It's the same as it was before, empty, still. The rain has stopped and the streetlights flicker weakly, casting pools of light on the wet pavement. Everything looks normal, but the officer feels anything but normal. The grip on their gun loosens and they stare at their reflection in the cracked glass of the window. For a moment, all they see is themselves, tired, shaken, barely holding on. But then, their breath catches. The reflection shifts, just for an instant. The twisted smile, the wild eyes, that same grotesque version of themselves staring back at them through the broken glass. It's gone in a flash, but the officer's heart pounds harder, a cold sweat breaking out across their skin. Was it real? Or was their mind playing tricks on them, warping reality in the aftermath of the terror? They reach out, touching the glass, fingers trembling, but the reflection remains unchanged now. Just their own face, pale, drawn, and hollow. But they know. Deep down, they know the truth. The break-in wasn't just into their apartment, it was into their mind, their soul. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't just an intruder. It was something far darker, something that came from inside them. The officer backs away from the window, the cracks in the glass still there, like a reminder of what they've seen, of what they've felt. The apartment feels suffocating now, like it's closing in on them, but there's nowhere to go. They've seen the darkness within themselves, and it's still there, lurking just beneath the surface. They can feel it in the way their hands still tremble, in the way the shadows seem to cling to the corners of the room. And as the officer stands there, alone in the quiet, they know one thing for certain. The real horror isn't the intruder. It's the fact that the intruder never truly left. It's still with them, a part of them, a darkness that can't be escaped. No matter how tightly they lock the door. Days pass, but the sense of normalcy never returns. The officer goes back to work, walking through the motions, but everything feels different now. The familiar sights and sounds of the city, the hum of distant traffic, the chatter of passers-by, the comforting routine of the job, none of it feels real anymore. It's as if a veil has been lifted, and beneath the surface of the world, there's something darker, something they can't quite shake. At first, they try to dismiss it, to convince themselves that it was just a break-in, just an intruder who somehow escaped. But the memory lingers, gnawing at them in the quiet moments, in the silence between conversations, in the long hours of the night. They catch glimpses of it in the corners of their vision, in the reflections of windows, in the dark spaces between streetlights. That twisted face, their own face, stares back at them from the shadows, always just out of reach. Sleep becomes elusive. Every time they close their eyes, they see it again, the intruder, the struggle, the horror of realizing what they were truly facing. And each night, the dream becomes more vivid, more terrifying, until they wake in a cold sweat, gasping for air, unsure if they're still asleep or trapped in some waking nightmare. But the worst part is the growing suspicion. The feeling that the darkness they faced wasn't just a product of that night. It was something that's been with them all along. Something that's always been lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. They begin to notice changes in themselves, small at first, moments of inexplicable rage, sudden flashes of fear. When they look in the mirror, there's a flicker of something unrecognizable in their own reflection, a hint of the twisted version of themselves that they faced that night. It's subtle, but it's there, creeping in at the edges, threatening to take hold. They try to push it away, to bury it deep down, but it's always there, waiting. And as the days turn into weeks, the officer starts to realize the terrifying truth. The intruder didn't break in from the outside. It came from within. And it's still there, a part of them now. Locked doors and drawn blinds won't keep it out, because it's in their mind, in their very being. The break-in wasn't just a physical act of violation. It was the start of something far worse. A slow, inevitable descent into a darkness they can't escape. And in the stillness of the night, as they stare into the mirror, they know that one day, that twisted grin will no longer be just a reflection. It will be them.